Welcome back. Section 9 is going to wrap up our discussion on buyer's consolidation. Going back to a point we mentioned a couple of times in the prior section, decisions on when to allocate purchase orders. This is really important because the advantage of buyer's consolidation is that we as the importer can allocate inventory. Again, this is an inventory management exercise as much as a logistical exercise, but we can allocate inventory based on the purchase orders we have placed on our overseas vendors. We need to tell those vendors and or the CFS operator how to split those POs. If we have a PO for 50,000 units of one item and they're going to our 3 DCs in California, Texas, and Pennsylvania, we need to tell somebody how to split those purchase orders. That somebody is either going to be the vendor before the goods go to the CFS or the CFS operator after they go to the CFS. Let's talk about the former of these two scenarios right now. The whole idea behind buyer's consol is the ability to allocate PO quantities from origin by destination. Basically, what items go to which destinations and in what quantities. But again, this is an origin deal, as we clearly saw in our previous section. Ideally, the allocation of PO quantities to a given destination is based off of a forecast and then actual demand signals. This bullet point should take us all the way back to our first 3 modules that talked about demand management, using a forecast to begin with and then actual demand signals. In our omni-channel environment, orders that are written with customers by our salespeople, online sales as a demand signal, retail purchases as a demand signal. We want to use those demand signals to guide us as the importer on how to split these POs amongst our various destinations. Last bullet, and this is the essence of the whole section, the key activity is the timing of the instructions for PO allocations by destination to a supplier. Do we provide those instructions prior to goods arriving at a CFS, or do we provide them after the goods arrive at a CFS? This is an operational, tactical, but yet strategic decision that importers have to make long before the first carton of cargo shows up at a CFS. In either of these scenarios, the allocation instructions should be communicated to the supplier and or the CFS operator electronically, ideally through a SaaS-based import management software platform. Second bullet. In the case of providing vendors with PO allocation instructions prior to arrival at a CFS, there are several considerations. And we as the importer need to be not only thinking about these things, but tactically preparing to execute upon them. What we're saying here is that we as the importer are going to tell the vendor overseas that purchase order that has 50,000 units on it, here's how you split them between the DC in California, Texas, and Pennsylvania. To do that, we need the ability to manage POs by date of issuance and expected ready date. It's a timing issue. When was a purchase order issued? And when is the cargo supposed to be ready? We need to manage that on an ongoing basis. We need an agreement on the means of communicating PO allocation instructions. Will it be by fax? Will it be by email? An Excel spreadsheet attachment? Or ideally, will we do that through a digital trading platform? Third sub-bullet, of course, we have to have the ability to manage purchase orders with multiple vendors at the same time. That's what buyer's consolidation is. Bringing merchandise from multiple vendors together during the same time frame, putting the merchandise in containers and shipping them to a specific destination. If we can't do that, there is no buyer's consolidation. Very important, last sub-bullet, the vendor must be able to prepare commercial documentation based on destination. Those 50,000 units of one item, 15,000 go to California, 15,000 go to Texas, and the remaining 20,000 go to Mechanicsburg. No problem. But we as the importer have to be able to send those instructions electronically to the vendor, and then the vendor has to create the documentation, 3 sets of docs, because there's 3 containers going to 3 different places. That's really what we're talking about here, when the instructions are given to the vendor before the goods get to the CFS. What else do we have in terms of what must go on in the case where PO allocation instructions are provided to vendors prior to arrival at a CFS? First on this slide, the CFS must be able to generate the CFR by vendor and destination, because the quantities coming into the CFS are already going to be divided by destination, the 3 destinations in our example. To have an FCR for the 3 of them is quite necessary. The importer in the United States has to coordinate cargo receipt into the CFS with container loading and agreed upon cutoff times. We talked about that in the previous section. Cutoff time into the CFS, cutoff time for container loading, cutoff time for drayage to the CY, cutoff time for ISF, VGM, and AMS filing. The importer has a very big role to play in buyer's consolidation. Each vendor's goods within a container needs its own bill of lading, its own house ocean bill of lading, and each shipment will require its own export customs clearance procedure. Some pretty complicated stuff from a coordination perspective. Buyer's consol can work really well. As we can see, the level of detail is what's going to drive the success of that program. In the case where PO allocation instructions are provided after goods arrive at a CFS, the following factors should be considered. Let's stop here for a second and say that CFS operators, 3PLs, can execute on this type of model. Not all of them do it very well. One of the reasons is that the CFS operator has to have the software necessary to account for all of the goods out in the physical world and how they're being split and allocated to containers. But they also have to have the software capability to generate documents, commercial invoices, and packing lists on behalf of the vendor pursuant to those split instructions. That's the big difference here. First sub-bullet. There has to be an agreed-upon means through which the importer transmits allocation instructions to the CFS operator. Once again, it can be fax, it can be email, it can be an Excel spreadsheet. We don't recommend any of that. What Mercado recommends is a digital trading platform that allows for all of these activities to be clearly managed and executed upon. Here's the big one. The CFS operator must be able to generate commercial docs by vendor and destination on behalf of that vendor. Each vendor's goods within a container require its own bill of lading. Just like we saw previously, an export customs clearance must still be coordinated with the vendor. To reiterate, some pretty complicated stuff from an operational perspective that requires an intense level of attention to detail by the vendor, by the CFS operator, and most especially by the importer. That's going to wrap up our sections on buyer's consolidation. We're going to continue on with other models like direct-to-store and transload when we come back.